Hi, I'm Kent Kramer. I'm the Chief Investment Officer at Foster Group. This is our bi-monthly video on financial perspectives, where we share things that have been happening in the economy or in markets that we think might be helpful for investors to know. This is a special version this week because recently Foster Group hosted author and speaker Morgan Housel. Morgan is the author of a book called The Psychology of Money. And we found that book to be really, really helpful around our office over the last year or so. We've been giving it out to a number of clients and people who are just interested in understanding how to invest. Morgan has a unique way of talking that weaves together an understanding of behavioral finance and psychology, as well as history, and kind of draws from those unique experiences and unique happenings in history with different people to make what we think are really good observations about the way we invest, and maybe some of the things that we would better understand ourselves if we knew what we were doing. We might have some blind spots, but he helps us talk about those and see ways we can be better investors and really just do better financially overall. So what we thought we'd do today is just take some excerpts from Morgan's talk and share those with you for the next few minutes. So in the first one, Morgan is going to be talking about two people. Grace was a secretary. She lived to be 100 years old. And when Grace died, she died with over $7 million in assets. And people were really confused as to how someone who'd been a secretary their whole life, really had not had any inheritances or anything else unusual happen, had died with so much money. And it turned out that what Grace had done is she had just bought stocks her whole life and let those stocks grow for 80 years. And when she died, she had accumulated quite a bit of money and had lived a very modest lifestyle. The other person was named Richard. Richard worked for a major Wall Street bank, and Richard had been extremely successful as an investor and a banker. And yet going through the 2008 financial crisis, he lost everything. He'd become bankrupt. And it turns out that Richard had made some financial decisions about lifestyle and the way that he invested and some other things that caused him to really have a different ending, even though he was investing right through the same time period as Grace. So let's listen to what Morgan says about what we can learn from the experience of these two investors.
What I think is interesting about those two stories is that there's no other industry in the world where that kind of comparison is even possible. There's no other industry other than investing where somebody with no education, no background, no experience, no connections can massively outperform at the same period somebody who has the best education, the best experience, the best connections. It does not happen in any other field. It's impossible to think of Grace doing open heart surgery better than a Harvard-trained cardiologist. That will never happen. But that equivalent does happen in investing, and it happens fairly often. And what that shows, I think, is something that's so easy to overlook in this industry, which is that good investing is not about what you know. It's not about how smart you are. It's not about where you went to school. It's nothing like that. What actually matters with good investing is just how you behave. It's your relationship with greed and fear, your ability to take a long-term mindset, how gullible you are, who you trust and who you seek your information from. That's what actually makes the biggest difference in your outcomes.
I thought that was a great story about two different investors and really the difference in their success having to do so much with behavior as opposed to actually how much money they had to invest. In our second clip, Morgan is going to be talking about the importance of understanding our time horizon and what it means to be a long-term investor. Pay particular attention to when Morgan talks about what the IRS deems as long-term.
And this is really important because if you ask most investors, are you a long-term investor? Most investors will tell you yes. Most investors think they are a long-term investor. But then if you ask them, what does long-term mean? What's the definition of long-term? A lot of investors will tell you 1 year is a long-term. And you laugh, but what's the IRS's definition of a long-term capital gain? It's 1 year. Some investors will tell you 3 years, 5 years, that's the long term. 10 years definitely feels like the long run, especially if you are in or nearing retirement. Even if we know that historically a pretty good definition of long term, the definition just being just not losing money in every holding period, is something between 10 and 20 years. So I think it's just so easy to underestimate how much time might be needed to put the odds of success firmly in your favor. And so we have to remind ourselves as investors that when progress is measured generationally, results should not be measured quarterly.
Isn't that great? I just think that idea of understanding what the long term really means and how as investors we need to be able to think not just in 1 or 2 or even 5 year periods, but in terms of 10 or 20 or even generational time periods to think about being a truly long-term investor and to put the probability or the odds in our favor of having a successful investment experience. In this next clip, Morgan is going to be talking about a concept called moving the goalposts. And what he means by that is sometimes we set the goal, and that's a good goal when we first set it, but then as time goes on, we just keep moving it. We keep raising or changing our expectations, and how moving those goalposts can cause us to lose sight of what's really maybe the most important thing to us.
Just the realization that wealth is a two-part equation. You need to grow your assets, grow your net income, and then keep that net income in check relative to your expectations. And it is so easy to ignore the last part of that equation. But if your assets, if your net worth, if your income is growing at the same rate of your expectations, or your expectations are growing faster, you will never be satisfied with what you have, and the past will always feel better than it actually was.
Okay, right after that story, Morgan told another one concerning two authors having a conversation. One author is going to share what Morgan says is a very important word for investors. Take a listen.
True story. Several years ago, many years ago, two authors, Kurt Vonnegut and Joseph Heller, were having lunch at the home of a hedge fund manager in the Hamptons. And Kurt Vonnegut turned to Joseph Heller and he said, "Joseph, do you know that the owner of this house earns more money per month than you have earned in your entire life?" And Joseph Heller said, "That might be true, but I have something that the hedge fund manager will never have, and that is enough money." And I think that word, this is probably the most important word that exists in all of financial planning. Because again, if you don't have some idea of what enough is, and that definition can be different for everyone, but if you don't go out of your way to try to define it for yourself, most people will learn about it the hard way. If you don't know how much is enough risk to take, you will learn about it the hard way when it ends up backfiring on you. Or how hard you want to work versus spending time with your family. You usually only realize how far you've gone when you've gone too far when it's too late in hindsight. It's almost never discussed in finance because it's always assumed that the right amount of money is just more than you have right now. And that's great. You can be ambitious, you can have goals, but if you don't have some sense of this word, it's always going to be a tough slog for you financially, and it's never going to feel as good as it should.
Knowing what's enough is really an important concept, isn't it? You know, one of Foster Group's main investment principles is the idea of embracing uncertainty. The idea that the world is a surprising place and things come about that we just don't see coming. Morgan's going to talk in this clip about how risk really is the things we don't see coming. Oftentimes we think of risk as things that we try to anticipate, the next election or a tax law change, or something's going to happen with the supply chain or the price of oil. They're all things we can kind of anticipate, but maybe the biggest risks are the things no one ever sees coming. Here Morgan talks about some risks people saw coming and the one that they didn't.
What's the biggest economic risk? What is the biggest risk out there for investors that they should be paying attention to? And we tend to, in the media particularly, we tend to personify these risks. So for a decade straight, we started debating whether this guy was the biggest risk. Was it Barack Obama? And the tax hikes of 2013, was that the biggest risk? Was it this guy, Ben Bernanke, the former chairman of the Fed? All the money printing after the financial crisis, was he the biggest risk? Was it this guy? Was it Donald Trump? The trade wars of the last 4 years, was that the biggest risk? This is what took up 90% of the oxygen in the industry for a decade, debating what's the biggest economic risk. And the irony about this, now that we know in hindsight, is that the answer to the question, who is the biggest economic risk, was none of these three guys. By an order of magnitude, it was this guy. It was a virus that no one was talking about. No economists had it in their outlook. No analysts had it in their investing forecast. No one said a word about it in the industry until the moment it arrived and 20 million people lost their jobs in 6 weeks. By far and away, the biggest risk is what no one was ever talking about. And I think if you look historically, back deeper in history, it's always the case that this is the case, that risk is what you do not see, and risk is what you're not talking about.
Yeah, it's important to embrace uncertainty because the world really is a surprising place. In this last clip, Morgan's going to talk about something that we also talk about in our Foster Group investment principles. And that's the idea that really our portfolios or the way that we invest should, first of all, be informed by our goals and by what's most important to us. Our financial plans, the way we invest money, they're all related to who we are individually. And what's right for us may not be right for anyone else. It certainly isn't going to be right for everyone. But it's important that we have a portfolio and a financial plan that is really suited to the things that are most important to us and that take into account the life experiences that we've had so far. Let's listen as Morgan wraps up.
The other thing to keep in mind is just realize that people who make different financial decisions than you are not always crazy. And there is a kind of a view in finance that investing is like math. And in math, there's one right answer for everyone. Doesn't matter how old you are, where you're from, 2 + 2 = 4. For everyone, one right answer. And I just think there's so much evidence that investing is not like that. That two people of the same age, the same income, the same education can come to totally different conclusions about what's right for them. Because based off of their individual history, they have a different risk tolerance, different aspirations, different family situations, whatever it is. And therefore, we should never expect that there's one right answer. A lot of times in finance, when you have people debating one another about, is this stock a good buy, yes or no? Is this a good way to invest, yes or no? And they're debating one another. Most of the time that happens, they're not actually debating each other. They're talking over each other without realizing that they're playing different games because they have different risk tolerances, different goals, different aspirations, because they've seen the world through a totally different lens. And I think it's so important in investing that you just become introspective about who you personally are and your own goals, your own risk tolerances, even if other people around you, your coworkers, your brothers and sisters, whatever it is, people in the same situation of you are coming to very different conclusions.
So you can see Morgan is really a great storyteller, but he draws great applications for us to think about as investors, as people who are managing our finances and thinking about goals down the road. It's more than really financial goals when you think about some of the ideas that he is sharing with us. If you haven't read Morgan's book, The Psychology of Money, I'd really encourage you to pick up a copy. This has been kind of a unique issue of Financial Perspectives, but we hope you've enjoyed it. For those of you who are able to be at our meeting where Morgan spoke in person, I'm sure you enjoyed it, or if you watched it online, that's great too. But again, if you haven't had a chance to see Morgan, I'd encourage you to pick up his book, The Psychology of Money. For future editions of Financial Perspectives, if you have any questions, please forward them to our contact information that you can see on the screen. We love to answer questions and talk about things that are important to you. And if there's kind of a conversation you'd like to have with a financial advisor, one of the Foster Group team, please give us a call or get a hold of us. We have people here every day who love nothing more than to have that conversation about what's important to you and talk a little bit about our psychology of money. So until next time, stay safe, be well, and we'll see you soon.